I work at Blackburn Museum, and I have to say it's great to work in a place like this because you've got so many objects, and if, like me, you're fascinated by the odd, the quirky and the weird, then this building is just rammed full of it. One of the great things about a place like this is folk just bring stuff in through the door. As I said to somebody who worked in the newspapers, stories just walk through the door. And how many times I've said over the years, come on then, tell me the tale. One in particular I well remember. I was in the Skill and Labour Gallery, and this elderly gentleman came up to me, and he pointed to this metal tin, and he said, "That's a weft tin." And to which I responded, "Yeah, I know." And he said, "I spent the first 6 weeks of my life living in a weft tin." And I had to say, of course, "Go on then, tell me the tale." He said, "Well, I were born on a Tuesday, and my mum had to go back to work the next day, and she couldn't find anyone to look after me. So she smuggled me into the weaving shed under a shawl, and she found a weft tin, lined it with cotton waste, and put me in it, and then slid me underneath the loom and got on to work weaving as she was. That was it, no work, no money, so she had to go back to work." And he said, like, she took me out and fed me as and when and cleaned me, and he then slid me back under the loom, and he spent the first 6 weeks of his life presumably doing 10-hour shifts underneath that loom until after 6 weeks he'd outgrown the weft tin. But by then, he said, my mother had found someone to look after me. I have to say, he was elderly and he was in good health, so it clearly didn't do him any harm. But it's a lovely story, and that's one of the stories I always like to remember. It's as you walk around the rooms and you look at the objects, and these objects just are. Some of them have been involved in like really famous incidents. We have a little powder compact, and it says on it, "Ladies' powder compact, doubtless bought as a souvenir on board the ship," and it says RMS Baltic. And of course the Baltic is one of the ships that went to rescue the Titanic survivors. So you get these little links to historic events. Sometimes, may not have been involved, but some of the objects around here in this room about us, stand as mute witnesses. You sometimes look at some of these objects and think, what have you witnessed? I've got a trench periscope from the battle, and when I found out how old it was made in August 1916. This has been used on the Battle of the Somme, and you can sometimes look through it and think, what has been witnessed through this little eyepiece? And on a more sort of light-hearted note, one of our most important things is when you walk into the Skill and Labour Gallery, we've got this enormous painting, painted in 1863, and it's the great and the good of mid-Victorian Blackburn, and they're all there in all their finery, and they all got painted because it was so terribly important, and some of them were devoted to great works, of that I have no doubt. But then, of course, when you start to look into them, you discover that one guy was stealing from his brothers-in-law. He'd deliberately gone bankrupt, made an arrangement with an agent, and sold. They'd given him, and it's the Thwaites. The Thwaites were his brothers-in-law, and they'd given him a lot of money to set himself up in a lifestyle to which he wanted to become accustomed. And of course, during the 1860s, money starts to run short, and he then goes bankrupt. And interestingly, we worked with a local accountancy firm, and we said to them, we asked for them for their help, and one guy came back to us, one of the partners. We gave him the details, and he said, "This is fascinating." He said, "Because the means change, but your basic frauds don't." And he was selling off all the possessions for pence through this agent, who would then have been selling them on for their proper value, and he would be pocketed, or they'd just split the money between them. And so there he is, looking proud upon his horse, waving his sword in the air, looking very noble, and in fact he was thieving from his brothers-in-law. A more honest thief, if you will, is also in the picture, Mr. Gourlay. It's interesting, he's the only one that doesn't look out of the canvas. He looks shifty, even as he was having his portrait painted. And in modern terms, he took £1.92 million out of the council coffers. Interestingly, when he was arrested, to save him embarrassment, the two policemen walked a few discreet paces behind him as he went to the police station to be arrested. Even then, despite what he'd done, he was accorded the dues of his status. One of the oddest things we've got in here is actually a pub sign, and it was from the oldest and the most historic pub in Blackburn, and it's of a gentleman playing a violin. And if you look closely at it, you might not recognise the likeness, but it's actually Niccolò Paganini, who was a real celebrity violinist, and he came and performed in Blackburn, and he stayed at this pub. The pub has gone. It was on Northgate, and a dry cleaners now stands on the spot, and there's a little blue plaque on the side of the wall. Blackburn had another rather less savoury reputation. It had more pubs and beer houses than any other town in Britain. There were more ways to get completely hammered in Blackburn than any other place in the UK. And because of this, it also had a very active temperance movement. And the temperance movement, there was a temperance bar in Blackburn Market until fairly recently. I don't know if it's still there. And the temperance movement was meant to try and encourage people not to drink, not to get paid on a Friday and then go and drink all your wages before you got home to the wife and kids. This kind of stuff was a very serious problem. And in the museum, we've got a large banner to Mrs. Lewis's temperance movement and a bust of the founder, as well as a massive collection of beer bottles and all sorts of other drinking paraphernalia. So that's an interesting tale, and they're both in the same case together, so you can see at one side the Paganini portrait, and at the other side the temperance movement. Yes, they could have really done with closing down any other pub. The only pub, they tried for years to close down pubs, but the only one they ever actively succeeded in closing down was probably the wrong one from Blackburn's point of view.